When 68-year-old Arthur Pendleton, leaning heavily on his cane, stopped by a Boston Whole Foods to buy a bag of sweet oranges for his daughter's dinner, a chance encounter changed everything. An old neighbor suddenly grabbed his hand, her face pale with worry, and whispered, "Arthur, your son-in-law has been hiding something from you." As the frail old man stood there looking bewildered, she revealed a truth that chilled him to the bone. Beneath his fragile, aging exterior, the retired auditor was forced to make a cold, calculating decision. He would meticulously destroy an entire web of lies in order to save his beloved daughter, Chloe. Welcome, everyone. Please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Quick note, this is a fictional story with dramatized elements. The names and details are imaginary, but the message of manipulation, family, and justice resonates deeply. So, what exactly did the neighbor tell Arthur that day, and how did a seemingly helpless old man orchestrate the perfect revenge? Let's find out. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket buzzed softly overhead as Beatrice, a woman who had lived down the street from Arthur for 20 years, tightened her grip on his frail wrist. She glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. She told him that she had been downtown near Copley Square the previous afternoon. She had walked past the gleaming windows of the Cartier boutique and saw Julian. He was not alone. He was buying a diamond necklace for a stunning young woman. Beatrice swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she confessed the worst part. She heard Julian playfully call the woman Sienna before he pulled her close and kissed her passionately right there in the showroom. Arthur let his mouth drop open. He widened his eyes, letting his cane wobble slightly on the polished floor, playing the part of a devastated, confused old man perfectly. He thanked Beatrice with a shaky voice, assuring her he would talk to his daughter. But as he turned away and limped toward the checkout counter, the bewilderment vanished from his eyes. His mind, trained by 4 decades of forensic auditing, immediately began to categorize the information. The location was Cartier. The action was purchasing high-end jewelry. The name of the companion was Sienna. The implications were catastrophic. An hour later, Arthur stood on the porch of Chloe and Julian's elegant townhouse in Beacon Hill. He rang the doorbell, leaning heavily on his cane, clutching the paper bag of sweet oranges. Chloe opened the door. She was wearing her blue hospital scrubs, her face pale and drawn. Dark circles framed her eyes, a testament to the brutal double shifts she had been working at the pediatric ward. She forced a bright smile for her father, ushering him out of the cold Boston air. Arthur handed her the oranges, coughing lightly into his fist. He shuffled into the living room, taking his usual spot on the plush sofa. The house was immaculate, decorated with expensive modern art and designer furniture that Julian insisted they needed for his image as a top-tier financial investment director. The front door opened with a confident click. Julian Vance stepped inside, bringing the scent of expensive cologne and the crisp autumn air with him. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hair impeccably styled. He barely glanced at Arthur, offering a dismissive nod before wrapping his arms around Chloe. He kissed her forehead, murmuring about a grueling day at the firm. They moved to the dining table for the roast chicken Chloe had rushed to prepare. Arthur ate slowly, his hands trembling with practiced fragility. Julian dominated the conversation, speaking in that smooth, practiced cadence he used to charm clients and manipulate his wife. He painted himself as a burdened martyr, carrying the weight of the world on his broad shoulders. Arthur waited for the perfect moment. He allowed his fingers to slip. His silver fork clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor, sliding under the edge of the mahogany table. Julian sighed deeply, a sound dripping with condescension. He muttered something under his breath about Arthur needing a bit. Chloe immediately jumped up to get a clean fork, her voice gentle as she told her father not to worry. But Arthur was not worried. As he bent down slowly, pretending to struggle to retrieve the dropped utensil, his sharp eyes locked onto Julian's left wrist resting casually near the edge of the table. Peeking out from the crisp white cuff of Julian's dress shirt was a watch. It was not just any watch. Arthur recognized the ceramic bezel and the distinctive dial instantly. It was a brand new Rolex Submariner. Arthur knew the current market value of that specific timepiece was at least $15,000. Arthur sat back up, thanking his daughter profusely as she handed him a fresh fork. He kept his expression vacant and apologetic. Julian took a sip of his wine and reached across the table to take Chloe's hand. His face morphed into a mask of deep sorrow. Julian told Chloe that he had just spoken to the care facility regarding his mother Margaret. He claimed Margaret's rheumatoid arthritis was worsening rapidly and she required experimental treatments that insurance absolutely refused to cover. He lowered his voice, making it sound thick with unshed tears. He stated that the new medical bills were astronomical, totaling over $35,000 just for the upcoming quarter. Chloe squeezed his hand, her own eyes filling with sympathetic tears. She immediately told Julian not to panic. She promised she would speak to the head nurse tomorrow and pick up 3 extra overnight shifts a week to help cover the costs. She assured him they would get through this crisis together, completely unaware that she was offering her lifeblood to a leech. Julian offered her a brave, tragic smile, praising her endless generosity. Arthur chewed a piece of roasted carrot in silence. He looked at his exhausted, fiercely loyal daughter, and then he looked at the man wearing a $15,000 watch while begging for money to pay fake medical bills. The neighbor's warning about the Cartier jewelry and the woman named Sienna echoed in Arthur's mind. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, painting a picture of financial abuse and deceit that was staggering in its cruelty. Beneath the table, Arthur's frail hand curled into a tight, unyielding fist. He did not say a word. He just kept eating, letting Julian believe he was the smartest man in the room, completely oblivious to the fact that the quiet old man across the table had just signed his absolute ruin. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. Julian subtly adjusted his cuffs, his eyes darting to the ceramic dial of his new timepiece. It was a calculated gesture, a silent dismissal communicating that the evening had dragged on long enough. Arthur took the cue immediately. He initiated a raspy cough, pressing a napkin to his lips, and apologized for keeping them up so late. Chloe immediately rushed to his side, her face tight with concern. She helped him out of his chair, her gentle hands guiding his trembling shoulders. Julian remained seated, swirling the last drops of his red wine, offering a tight, obligatory smile and a hollow promise to visit soon. At the front door, Chloe helped Arthur into his heavy wool coat. She buttoned the top button for him, her eyes searching his wrinkled face. She whispered that she was sorry if Julian seemed tense tonight. She explained that the stress of his mother's failing health was tearing him apart. She said Julian was a proud man who hated asking for help, but he was drowning in the $35,000 of medical debt. She begged her father to understand and not to judge him. Arthur looked at his daughter, his heart aching at the depth of her pure, misplaced loyalty. He patted her cheek with a shaking hand, telling her she was a good wife and a wonderful daughter. He promised her he understood perfectly. He understood far more than she could possibly imagine. The taxi ride back to his modest home in the quiet suburbs took 40 minutes. Arthur sat in the back seat, his head resting against the cold window, watching the streetlights blur past. He maintained his slight hunch and unsteady breathing until the taxi pulled away from his curb. He walked up the concrete path to his front door, his cane clicking rhythmically. He turned the key, stepped inside, and pushed the heavy oak door shut. The moment the deadbolt clicked into place, the atmosphere in the hallway shifted. Arthur stood perfectly still in the dim light. Slowly, deliberately, the stoop in his spine vanished. He stood up straight, revealing a surprisingly broad frame hidden beneath the oversized coat. He lifted his right hand, the hand that had trembled violently while holding the teacup just an hour ago. It was now as steady as carved stone. He looked down at the wooden cane in his left hand, a prop he had perfected over the last year. He hung it neatly on a brass hook near the door. He did not need it. He had never needed it. Arthur walked down the hall with purposeful, silent strides. He entered his study, the only room in the house that Chloe rarely visited. It was not the messy, cluttered room of a senile old man. It was a sterile, highly organized sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held heavy volumes on tax law, forensic accounting, and corporate fraud. He sat down at his heavy mahogany desk and clicked on the brass banker's lamp. The pool of warm light illuminated a pristine leather-bound notebook. Arthur unlocked the top drawer and retrieved a vintage silver fountain pen. He uncapped it, the nib glinting in the light. For 40 years, Arthur had made his living hunting ghosts in financial ledgers. He had unraveled offshore shell companies, exposed corrupt CEOs, and tracked missing millions through labyrinths of falsified documents. He knew that liars always left a trail. They always made mistakes because arrogance blinded them to their own vulnerabilities. Julian Vance was incredibly arrogant. Julian believed he was dealing with a frail, fading mind. That would be his fatal error. Arthur opened the notebook to a fresh, lined page. At the top, he wrote a single name in sharp, precise cursive. Julian Vance. Beneath the name, he drew a vertical line, splitting the page into two columns. The left column was for the illusion. The right column was for the reality. In the left column, he wrote down the narrative Julian was spinning. He noted the claim of a struggling financial market. He documented the assertion of $35,000 required for Margaret's immediate arthritis treatment. He wrote about Julian's manufactured stress and his performance as a desperate, grieving son. Then, his pen moved to the right column. Here, he documented the hard, physical evidence his trained eyes had gathered. Item 1. The Cartier boutique sighting in Copley Square. The purchase of a diamond necklace. A woman named Sienna. Item 2. The Rolex Submariner. Current retail market value exceeding $15,000. Arthur stared at the two columns. The mathematics of the deception were glaringly obvious. A man who was genuinely drowning in $35,000 of family medical debt did not walk into a luxury jeweler to buy diamonds for a mistress. A man desperate for cash did not sport a brand new luxury dive watch. Julian was not struggling. Julian was siphoning. He was draining Chloe's hard-earned savings, utilizing her immense capacity for empathy as a weapon against her, transferring her money into a slush fund to finance his extravagant shadow life. The sheer audacity of the crime made Arthur's blood run ice cold. Julian was treating Chloe not as a wife, but as a bank, feeding off her exhaustion while parading his ill-gotten wealth right in front of her blinded eyes. Arthur closed his eyes, mapping out the architecture of the fraud. To destroy a narcissist like Julian, accusations and tears would be useless. Julian would simply gaslight Chloe, twist the narrative, and paint Arthur as a jealous, paranoid old man trying to ruin her marriage. No, Arthur needed something indestructible. He needed a paper trail so dense and irrefutable that Julian would be suffocated by it. He needed bank statements, credit card receipts, hotel bookings, and photographic evidence. He needed to track every single penny that flowed from Chloe's accounts to Julian's secret life. Arthur opened a lower drawer and pulled out a locked metal cash box. Inside lay neat stacks of $100 bills, his emergency fund. He counted out $5,000. Gathering this level of surveillance required a professional, someone who operated in the gray areas of the law and asked no questions. Arthur knew exactly who to call. He flipped to the back of his notebook, his steady hand tracing over a name he had not contacted in 5 years. Victor Rollins. The hunt had officially begun. The morning air in South Boston carried the bitter chill of impending winter. Arthur Pendleton stepped out of a yellow cab, his trembling hand heavily gripping the carved wooden handle of his cane. He shuffled toward a weathered brick building squeezed between a dive bar and a closed bakery. He climbed the 2 flights of stairs with agonizing slowness, playing the part of a fragile senior citizen perfectly for the benefit of anyone watching. He reached a frosted glass door with faded black lettering that read Victor Rollins Investigations. Arthur turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The office smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Behind a battered steel desk sat Victor Rollins. Vic was 55 years old, a former fraud detective with a rough complexion and tired eyes. He looked up from a stack of files, taking in the sight of the hunched, frail man hovering in his doorway. Vic let out a quiet sigh, already preparing a gentle speech to turn away what he assumed was a confused pensioner looking for a lost dog or complaining about stolen mail. Arthur stepped inside. He pushed the door shut until the lock clicked firmly into place. Then, the transformation occurred. Arthur straightened his spine, shedding the posture of a weak old man like a heavy coat. He walked to the empty wooden chair opposite Vic with steady, deliberate steps. He did not lean on the cane. Instead, he placed it casually across his lap as he sat down. His pale blue eyes, previously wide and bewildered, narrowed into a gaze as sharp as a scalpel. Vic stopped breathing for a second. The seasoned detective immediately recognized the shift. The man sitting across from him was not a victim. He was a predator. Arthur reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew a thick manila envelope alongside his pristine leather notebook. He placed the envelope on the scratched metal surface of the desk and slid it forward. Vic eyed the package before pulling it closer. He flicked the flap open. Inside were neat, banded stacks of $100 bills. Arthur stated his terms in a voice devoid of any tremor. He announced that there was $5,000 in the envelope as a retainer. He added that there would be another $5,000 when the job was completed to his exact specifications. Vic leaned back in his chair, his respect instantly earned. He asked Arthur what he needed him to hunt. Arthur opened his leather notebook and turned it around so Vic could see the meticulously drawn columns. He pointed to the name at the very top. Julian Vance. Arthur explained that Julian was his son-in-law, a highly successful financial investment director on paper, but a parasitic fraud in reality. He detailed how Julian was systematically draining his daughter Chloe, manipulating her immense empathy to extract tens of thousands of dollars under the guise of fake medical emergencies. Vic scanned the immaculate handwriting. He saw the notations regarding a $15,000 luxury watch and a Cartier diamond necklace. He let out a low whistle, realizing he was looking at the preliminary work of a master auditor. He told Arthur that these guys always thought they were untouchable because they wore expensive suits and used big words. Arthur nodded slowly. He instructed Vic to shadow Julian every single day. He wanted Julian followed from the moment he left his Beacon Hill townhouse until he returned to his exhausted wife. Arthur demanded photographic evidence of every extravagant lunch, every hotel visit, and every luxury purchase. Most importantly, Arthur gave Vic the name of the woman from the Cartier boutique, Sienna Sterling. He wanted to know where she lived, where she worked, and exactly how much of Chloe's money Julian was spending on her. Vic picked up a pen, a dark smile spreading across his rough face. He told Arthur that a man like Julian would definitely leave a paper trail of credit card receipts because narcissists love the prestige of a black card too much to pay in cash. Vic promised to dig into the restaurant tabs, the jewelry stores, and any hidden accounts he could trace through his underground network. Arthur closed his notebook with a soft, final thud. He reiterated that Julian had just convinced Chloe to work devastating overtime shifts to cover $35,000 in fabricated medical debt for his mother, Margaret. Arthur wanted that specific money tracked. He needed to know the exact offshore account or hidden slush fund where those funds were deposited. Vic promised he would have a preliminary report within 48 hours. He slid the envelope of cash into his desk drawer, fully committing to the hunt. Arthur stood up. He picked up his wooden cane. As he reached the office door, the stoop returned to his shoulders. His hands began to tremble once more, and his steps became slow and uncertain. He opened the door and shuffled out into the cold hallway, leaving Vic staring after him in absolute awe. The trap was set, and the old auditor was ready to watch his prey walk right into it. 3 days after his meeting with Victor Rollins, Arthur Pendleton initiated the next phase of his operation. He needed access to the epicenter of Julian Vance's financial life. To get inside the Beacon Hill townhouse while Julian was at the firm, Arthur had to weaponize the very empathy that Julian exploited. Early Tuesday morning, Arthur dialed his daughter's number. He kept his throat dry, letting his voice crack and wheeze. He told Chloe he felt terribly weak, dizzy, and unable to stand without his vision swimming. Panic flooded Chloe's voice. She abandoned her morning routine, drove straight to his house, packed a small overnight bag for him, and brought him back to her place. She carefully tucked him under a heavy cashmere throw on the living room sofa, placing a cup of hot chamomile tea on the glass coffee table. Arthur kept his eyes half closed, breathing shallowly, playing the fragile victim to absolute perfection. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, while Chloe was packing her medical scrubs for her upcoming double shift at the pediatric ward, her cell phone rang. It was Julian. She answered it on speakerphone while searching for her stethoscope in the kitchen, assuming Arthur was fast asleep in the next room. Arthur slowly slid his own smartphone from his pocket, navigating to the voice memo application with a silent swipe of his thumb. He hit record. Julian's voice filled the room, crisp and dripping with irritation. He demanded to know why the house smelled like medicinal rub and stale tea. Chloe softly explained that her father was very ill and she could not leave him alone at his own house. Julian scoffed loudly, a sound of pure disgust. He complained that Arthur was becoming a massive burden. He told Chloe that her father was useless, a pathetic old man who just wanted attention and had nothing to offer. Julian coldly suggested they look into a cheap state-run nursing home because he was tired of having his pristine townhouse treated like a hospice ward. He added that he was stressed enough trying to secure $35,000 for his own mother, and Arthur was just an annoying, worthless distraction that was draining his energy. Chloe's voice wavered, thick with unshed tears. She apologized repeatedly, begging Julian to be patient. She promised she would clean everything up before he got home and work extra hours this weekend so Julian would not have to worry about the finances. Arthur lay perfectly still, the audio recording capturing every single syllable of Julian's emotional abuse. The sheer contempt in Julian's voice was sickening. He was stripping away Chloe's dignity with surgical precision. But this cruel monologue was exactly the kind of psychological ammunition Arthur needed for the final execution. Julian abruptly ended the call without saying goodbye. Chloe stood in the kitchen, wiping her eyes. She took a deep, shuddering breath to compose herself and walked over to the sofa. She checked Arthur's temperature with the back of her hand, whispering a soft apology to her seemingly sleeping father. She told him she had to leave for her shift but would call to check on him during her dinner break. The front door opened and closed. The heavy deadbolt slid into place with a definitive click. Arthur waited precisely 5 minutes. The townhouse fell completely silent, save for the low hum of the luxury refrigerator. The frail, wheezing old man immediately evaporated. Arthur threw off the cashmere blanket. He stood up smoothly, his joints completely steady and his posture perfectly straight. He saved the audio file, uploaded it to a secure cloud server, and slipped his smartphone back into his pocket. He walked past the lavish dining room and the pristine kitchen, heading straight down the hall toward the master suite. Adjacent to the bedroom was Julian's private home office. It was the only room in the house that Chloe was strictly forbidden from entering. Julian claimed it contained highly sensitive client portfolios that required absolute confidentiality, a lie designed to keep his wife away from his secrets. Arthur stood before the heavy oak door. He gripped the brass handle. It was locked, exactly as he expected. Julian was meticulous, but he was also a creature of habit and immense ego. Arthur knelt slightly, examining the keyhole. It was a standard pin tumbler lock, not a high-security biometric system. A man who bought a $15,000 watch to show off at family dinners did not install industrial safes inside his own home because he fundamentally believed no one around him was smart enough to challenge him. Arthur pulled a small, flat leather case from his inner coat pocket. Inside was a set of tension wrenches and lock picks, tools he had kept from his early days of field auditing when uncooperative corporate executives suddenly lost the keys to their filing cabinets. He inserted the tension wrench, applying gentle pressure. He slid the pick inside, feeling for the binding pin. His movements were fluid, patient, and practiced. He had spent 4 decades dissecting complex tax evasion schemes, so bypassing a standard residential lock was almost insultingly easy. The cylinder turned. The lock disengaged with a soft, satisfying click. Arthur pushed the door open and stepped into the lion's den. The office smelled of expensive leather and arrogance. Framed certificates lined the walls, overlooking a massive dual-monitor computer setup resting on a sleek glass desk. Arthur closed the door behind him and locked it from the inside. He approached the desk, ready to rip the mask off the monster and expose the bleeding numbers underneath. Arthur sat down in the ergonomic leather chair, placing his hands lightly on the edge of the sleek glass desk. He nudged the computer mouse. The dual monitors flared to life, illuminating the dark office with a harsh, clinical glow. A login screen appeared, demanding a password beneath Julian Vance's profile picture. A lesser investigator might have panicked, trying birth dates, anniversaries, or the name of Julian's wife. But Arthur was a master of human behavior as much as he was a master of finance. He understood the fundamental architecture of a narcissistic mind. Julian despised vulnerability and revered his own perceived brilliance. He viewed his marriage to Chloe not as a partnership, but as a convenience. Therefore, his digital fortress would never be secured by anything related to her. A narcissist's password is a shrine to their own ego, a daily reminder of their superiority. Arthur closed his eyes, accessing his photographic memory. He recalled the Thanksgiving dinner 3 years prior. Julian had consumed too much scotch and relentlessly bragged about the transaction that secured his position as a director at the firm. He had engineered a hostile takeover of a rival company called Apex Holdings, burning a massive 7-figure commission. Julian had gloated about that specific victory for hours, calling it his masterpiece. Arthur opened his eyes. He leaned forward and typed the word Apex, making the first letter capital, followed by the exact date the merger was finalized, May 14th. He pressed the Enter key. The screen froze for a fraction of a second before the login prompt vanished. Access granted. The desktop appeared, cluttered with seemingly mundane financial portfolios and client presentation files. Arthur ignored all the visible folders. He knew these were just window dressing. His fingers danced across the keyboard with the speed and precision of a seasoned forensic auditor. He opened the system directory, bypassing the standard user interface to search for hidden partitions. Within 2 minutes, he located a secondary drive buried deep within the system architecture. It was secured by a commercial encryption software. For Arthur, this barrier was incredibly simple to dismantle. He reached into his pocket and produced a small silver flash drive attached to his keychain. He inserted it into the computer port. The drive contained a decryption algorithm he had acquired during his years unraveling corporate fraud for the federal government. He initiated the sequence. The progress bar filled rapidly. A soft chime echoed in the quiet room as the encrypted vault unlocked. Arthur opened the newly exposed directory. The folders inside were labeled with innocuous alphanumeric codes, designed to look like junk data. He opened the most recently modified spreadsheet. The blood-stained numbers immediately flooded the screen. Arthur felt a physical tightness in his chest as he traced the digital footprint of the $35,000 Chloe had painstakingly scraped together. He watched the money flow outward from their joint savings account. The narrative Julian had spun about medical bills for his mother, Margaret, completely evaporated into a sea of undeniable proof. The funds did not go to any hospital, pharmacy, or physical therapy clinic. Instead, the $35,000 was immediately transferred into a shell corporation registered in Delaware under the name Sterling Vanguard Limited. Sterling. The exact last name of the woman from the Cartier boutique. Arthur opened the corresponding bank statements linked to that specific shell account. The transaction history was a horrific catalog of betrayal and bottomless greed. Arthur read the charges, his cold rage solidifying into pure, calculated vengeance. There was a charge for $4,000 at a Chanel boutique on Newbury Street. There was a transaction for $2,000 at an exclusive omakase sushi restaurant. There was a massive debit for $8,000 to a luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado, booked for a 5-day romantic getaway. And there, sitting at the very top of the ledger, was the most recent transaction. It was a $12,000 charge processed by Cartier in Copley Square. The diamond necklace. Chloe was quite literally trading her physical and mental health, working brutal pediatric overnight shifts, to finance the extravagant lifestyle of her husband's young mistress. Julian was bleeding her dry to buy his own godhood. Arthur knew he could not risk forwarding these files to his own email address. Julian would undoubtedly check the network router logs and discover the data breach. Instead, Arthur pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He wiped the camera lens on his sleeve to ensure absolute clarity. Meticulously, he began to photograph every single document displayed on the monitors. He took 64 high-resolution pictures, ensuring that every account number, every date, and every dollar amount was perfectly legible. He captured the routing numbers, the shell company registration details, and the staggering credit card receipts. Every photograph he took was another nail he would eventually hammer into Julian's meticulously crafted coffin. Once he had secured all the evidence, Arthur closed the hidden partition. He safely ejected his flash drive and slipped it back into his pocket. He cleared the recent files cache and wiped the temporary memory logs, ensuring his digital footprints were completely erased. He locked the computer, returning the login screen to the exact state he had found it in. Arthur pulled a pristine microfiber cloth from his inner pocket. He carefully wiped down the keyboard, the mouse, the edges of the desk, and the power button, erasing any trace of his fingerprints. He stood up and examined the room with a critical eye. He adjusted the leather desk chair so the wheels aligned perfectly with the faint indentations on the expensive Persian rug. He checked the angle of the brass pin holder, nudging it a fraction of an inch to the left. Everything was flawless. Arthur unlocked the office door, stepped back into the quiet hallway, and engaged the lock with his tension wrench. A soft click confirmed the door was secure once more. He walked silently back to the living room, laid down on the plush sofa, and pulled the heavy cashmere throw up to his chin. He closed his eyes and slowed his breathing to a rhythmic, shallow wheeze. When Julian returned home that evening, he would find nothing but a pathetic old man sleeping in his living room, completely unaware that the frail ghost on his couch possessed the power to annihilate his entire existence. 48 hours after Arthur successfully breached the encrypted hard drive in the Beacon Hill townhouse, a secure email arrived in his private inbox. He was sitting at his heavy mahogany desk in his quiet suburban study, the brass banker lamp casting a warm glow over his pristine leather notebook. The sender was Victor Rollins. The subject line was completely blank. Arthur clicked the decryption link, entered the agreed-upon passcode, and watched as a massive file downloaded onto his local server. Victor Rollins had earned every single penny of his $5,000 retainer. The report was a masterpiece of surveillance, transforming the cold digital receipts Arthur had photographed into brutal, high-resolution reality. Arthur opened the first folder labeled Sienna Sterling. He stared at a series of candid photographs taken outside a high-end contemporary art gallery in the Back Bay neighborhood. Sienna was 28 years old, with striking features and an air of effortless luxury. She was wearing the exact $4,000 Chanel handbag Arthur had seen on Julian's hidden bank statements. The accompanying dossier from Victor revealed that Sienna managed the gallery and was entirely under the impression that Julian was a wealthy investment director currently finalizing a divorce from a deeply unstable, financially irresponsible wife. Julian had spun a narrative of victimization, painting Chloe as a burden he was bravely trying to shed. Arthur felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. He clicked to the next folder, which documented the Aspen getaway. The digital receipts Arthur had found previously were agonizing to read, but the visual proof was a different kind of torture. Victor had managed to scrape deleted social media posts and acquire hotel lobby security stills. There were pictures of Julian and Sienna clinking crystal champagne flutes on a sun-drenched balcony overlooking snow-capped mountains. There were records of first-class flights, private ski instructors, and a sprawling luxury suite at the St. Regis. The total expenditure for the 5-day trip was just over $8,000. Arthur opened his leather notebook and carefully turned the pages back to the second week of February. He traced his finger down the left column, the column dedicated to Julian's elaborate illusions. He found the exact dates. During those specific 5 days, Julian had told Chloe he was required to attend a grueling, mandatory financial arbitration in freezing Chicago. He had complained endlessly about the stress, demanding Chloe pack his most conservative suits and ensuring she felt immense pity for his heavy corporate burden. Chloe had kissed him goodbye at the door, completely exhausted from a string of double shifts, apologizing that she could not make him breakfast before his flight. While Chloe was eating vending machine sandwiches in the fluorescent glow of the pediatric ward, her husband was speeding down pristine alpine slopes in designer ski gear, entirely funded by the money she had bled to save. Arthur meticulously cross-referenced every single expense in Victor's report with the dates in his notebook. The $2,000 omakase sushi dinner occurred on the night of Chloe's birthday, an evening Julian claimed he was trapped at the office finalizing a quarterly review. The $12,000 Cartier diamond necklace was purchased on a Tuesday afternoon, merely hours before Julian sat at Chloe's dining table, displaying his new Rolex and extorting $35,000 for his mother's fictional medical crisis. The picture of betrayal was now absolute. The financial flow was mapped, the mistress was identified, and the timeline of deceit was unshakable. Julian had created a flawless parasite ecosystem, feeding on Chloe's purest virtues to sustain his own monumental vanity. Arthur closed the encrypted file and shut his laptop. He sat in the profound silence of his study, letting the cold reality of the situation settle deep into his bones. He had successfully documented the lavish theft and the adultery. However, there was one final, crucial element of Julian's lie that remained unchecked. It was the darkest piece of the puzzle, the emotional lever Julian had pulled to extract the largest sum of money. Julian claimed his mother, Margaret, was suffering in a high-end medical facility, requiring $35,000 for experimental arthritis treatments. Arthur knew the money had gone to a shell company, but he needed to know the physical truth about Margaret's living conditions to completely seal the trap. He needed to witness the true depth of the sociopathy. He pulled out a map of the greater Boston area, his wrinkled hand tracing a route toward the desolate outskirts of the city, preparing himself for a journey into the final shadow of his son-in-law's monstrous deception. The morning frost clung stubbornly to the windows of the city bus as it rumbled away from the polished heart of Boston and out toward the bleak, industrial fringes of the county. Arthur Pendleton sat near the back, his gloved hands resting on the curved handle of his wooden cane. He had purposefully left his comfortable sedan parked in his driveway. If Julian had hired someone to watch him, a paranoid but entirely plausible scenario given the magnitude of the fraud, Arthur needed to appear exactly as he was supposed to be, an impoverished, struggling senior citizen running mundane errands in the bitter cold. The journey took nearly 2 hours. Every rattle of the heavy suspension drove an ache into Arthur's real bones, providing a stark physical reminder of the contrast between this miserable, freezing ride and the first-class leather seats Julian had enjoyed on his flight to Aspen. Arthur watched the landscape shift from manicured suburban lawns to strip malls, and finally to decaying warehouses and cracked asphalt. As the scenery worsened, Arthur thought of Chloe. He pictured his daughter finishing her grueling 14-hour overnight shift at the pediatric ward, her eyes bloodshot, believing her utter exhaustion was saving a life. Her sacrifice was holy, and Julian had turned it into a cruel punchline. The bus hissed to a halt at a desolate, wind-swept intersection. Arthur stepped down onto the icy sidewalk, pulling his heavy wool coat tighter around his thin frame. Ahead of him, sitting at the end of a long, weed-choked driveway, was Shady Pines Convalescent Center. Arthur stood at the edge of the property and let his trained, analytical eyes scan the exterior. Julian had tearfully claimed this was a premier medical facility, a place providing cutting-edge, experimental arthritis treatments that absolutely justified a $35,000 quarterly fee. The reality standing before Arthur was a grim, 2-story concrete block that looked more like an abandoned minimum security prison than a place of healing. The pale yellow paint was peeling in massive, leprous strips. The gutters hung loose from the roofline, dripping freezing rainwater onto the shattered pavement of the parking lot. There were no manicured healing gardens, no soothing water features, and certainly no state-of-the-art medical transport vehicles waiting by the entrance. There was only an overwhelming, oppressive sense of institutional decay. Arthur tightened his grip on his cane and began the slow, deliberate walk up the driveway. He hunched his shoulders forward, instantly reassembling his disguise. He pushed open the heavy glass front doors, noting the greasy handprints and grime smeared across the panes. The smell hit him immediately like a physical blow. It was a suffocating, deeply depressing mixture of cheap industrial bleach, overcooked cabbage, and the distinct, sour odor of unwashed linens. The lobby was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed like dying insects. A few residents sat slumped in mismatched, vinyl wheelchairs, staring blankly at a television that was blaring a daytime soap opera with highly distorted audio. Arthur shuffled toward the front reception desk. A bored-looking woman in faded green scrubs sat behind a thick sheet of scratched plexiglass, vigorously chewing a piece of gum while scrolling aimlessly on her smartphone. She did not bother to look up when Arthur approached. He cleared his throat, allowing a dry, rattling cough to escape his lips. He asked politely, his voice trembling just enough to sound pathetic and easily dismissible, if he could visit a resident named Margaret Vance. The receptionist sighed heavily, visibly annoyed by the interruption to her morning. She clicked her computer mouse a few times, her eyes scanning a bulky, outdated monitor. She chewed her gum loudly before pointing a fake, acrylic fingernail down a dark, narrow corridor to her left. She told him Margaret was in room 114, located at the very end of the hall, and lazily warned him not to slip on the wet floor near the broken ice machine. She never asked for his identification, his relation to the patient, or even his name. The security protocols were virtually non-existent, a glaring sign of severe underfunding. Arthur thanked her profusely, bowing his head in a practiced show of elderly submission. He turned and made his way down the designated hallway. The living conditions only worsened as he moved away from the main lobby. The linoleum tiles beneath his feet were cracked, stained, and lifting at the corners. Water stains bloomed like dark, toxic clouds across the sagging drop ceiling panels. As he walked, he passed open doorways, catching fleeting glimpses of neglected elderly patients staring vacantly at peeling wallpaper or sleeping under thin, worn blankets. It was not a medical center. It was a warehouse for the forgotten. The forensic auditor within Arthur calculated the grim economics of the facility with ruthless efficiency. State-funded Medicaid might cover the absolute bare minimum of existence here, perhaps a few $1,000s a month for a shared, cramped room and basic nutritional sustenance. It was mathematically impossible that anyone was paying $35,000 a quarter for this profound level of squalor. Julian had not merely lied about the exorbitant cost of the specialized care. Julian had completely abandoned his own flesh and blood to the lowest possible tier of human existence, pocketing the massive financial difference to buy diamond pendants and luxury ski passes for Sienna sterling. Arthur reached the very end of the corridor. The door to room 114 was slightly ajar. The brass numbers screwed into the wood were heavily tarnished and crooked. Arthur paused in the dim light, taking a slow, deep breath to steady the violent rage boiling inside his chest. He was about to confront the ultimate, living proof of Julian's monstrous greed. He raised his knuckles and knocked softly on the scratched wood, ready to step into the darkest, most tragic chapter of his son-in-law's deceit. Arthur tapped his knuckles against the scratched wood of door 114. A frail, paper-thin voice called out from the shadows within, granting him permission to enter. Arthur pushed the door open, the rusted hinges whining in protest. The air inside the cramped room was significantly colder than the hallway, carrying a damp, bone-chilling draft that seemed to seep directly through the cracked window pane. Sitting in a faded vinyl armchair facing the parking lot was Margaret Vance. She looked incredibly small, a fragile bird wrapped in a threadbare, gray cardigan that offered zero protection against the bitter draft. Her hands rested in her lap, her knuckles swollen and twisted by the arthritis Julian had weaponized to steal his wife's savings. Arthur removed his heavy wool coat and his hat, stepping fully into the dismal room. He kept his voice incredibly soft, introducing himself as Arthur Pendleton, Chloe's father. Margaret blinked her watery blue eyes, her face registering genuine shock. She managed a weak, trembling smile, struggling to sit up straighter in the sagging chair. She whispered that it was a blessing to meet him, apologizing that she had nothing to offer a guest. Arthur pulled up the only other piece of furniture in the room, a rusted folding chair, and sat beside her. He looked around the depressing space. There were no medical monitors, no specialized orthopedic equipment, and no private nurses. There was just a narrow bed with a sagging mattress, a tiny television with a cracked screen, and a profound, suffocating sense of isolation. Arthur carefully brought up the subject of her medical care. He mentioned that Julian and Chloe were terribly worried about her rapidly deteriorating condition and the new, experimental treatments she was undergoing. Margaret tilted her head, a look of utter confusion washing over her pale face. She let out a dry, rasping cough before asking what experimental treatments he meant. She explained that she only took generic ibuprofen for her joints and a standard blood pressure pill the overworked nurses handed out every morning. She confessed that there was no specialized care here because it was a state-subsidized facility. She lowered her eyes, her voice barely a whisper, revealing that her entire existence in this miserable room was funded solely by her Social Security check of $1,200 a month. The mathematical reality hit Arthur like a physical strike to the chest. $35,000. Julian had looked into his exhausted wife's eyes, watched her pledge to work herself into a state of physical collapse, and taken $35,000 to allegedly save this woman's life. Yet, not a single penny had reached Margaret. Every dollar had been diverted to a shell company to fund ski trips and diamonds for a mistress. Arthur swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He gently placed his hand over Margaret's trembling fingers. He asked her when Julian had last come to visit. The question broke whatever fragile emotional dam the old woman had built to survive her reality. Margaret let out a quiet, devastated sob. Tears spilled over her wrinkled cheeks, dropping onto her faded cardigan. She wept with the profound, soul-crushing grief of a mother who realizes she has been discarded. She choked out the words, admitting that she had not seen her son in 8 long months. He did not call. He did not send letters. He had simply dropped her off in this concrete purgatory and vanished into his glamorous, wealthy life, leaving her to wait for death in a freezing room that smelled of bleach and despair. She wept into her hands, apologizing to Arthur for losing her composure, repeatedly calling herself a useless burden. Arthur sat in the freezing room, listening to the agonizing sound of a mother crying for the son who had thrown her away like garbage. The rage that had been simmering inside Arthur's chest crystallized into something entirely different. It was no longer just about recovering stolen money or exposing an affair. It was about absolute, biblical retribution. Julian Vance possessed a sickness of the soul that was beyond redemption. He was a monster who wore tailored suits and $15,000 watches while his own flesh and blood froze in the dark. Arthur did not try to offer Margaret empty platitudes. He did not tell her everything would be fine, because everything was fundamentally broken. Instead, he simply held her hands, offering the silent, steadfast comfort of another human being. He sat with her for nearly an hour until her tears subsided into exhausted, shallow breaths. Before he stood up to leave, Arthur looked directly into Margaret's tired, watery eyes. He promised her, with a voice as solid as granite, that her situation was going to change very soon. He told her she would not be forgotten. Arthur put his coat back on, picked up his cane, and walked out of room 114. He did not hunch his shoulders as he navigated the bleak corridors of Shady Pines. He walked with the terrifying, upright posture of an executioner who had just read the final, damning page of a criminal's ledger. The investigation was officially over. The evidence was absolute. It was time to go home, compile the verdict, and prepare the gallows. The journey back from the desolate outskirts of the city felt different. The freezing bus ride no longer bothered Arthur Pendleton. His mind was a locked vault, entirely consumed by the architecture of the impending execution. He returned to his quiet suburban home as the winter sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across his mahogany desk. He did not turn on the main overhead light. He merely clicked the brass banker lamp, bathing his workspace in a focused, clinical glow. He booted up his encrypted laptop and connected it to a high-yield laser printer. For the next 3 hours, the only sound in the silent house was the rhythmic, mechanical whir of paper sliding into the output tray. Arthur was manifesting the digital ghosts into physical, undeniable reality. He pulled 4 heavy, crimson-red folders from his bottom drawer. He laid them side by side on the polished wood. With the absolute precision of a master auditor, he began to categorize the evidence, labeling each file with a thick black marker. He labeled the first folder adultery. Inside, he placed the high-resolution photographs Victor Rollins had procured. There was the image of Julian and Sienna Sterling clinking champagne flutes on the Aspen balcony. There was the security still from the Cartier boutique. He attached the receipts for the luxury dinners and the designer handbags, highlighting the dates in bright yellow ink. He labeled the second folder embezzlement. This was the financial kill shot. He stacked the bank statements showing the massive transfer of $35,000 out of Chloe's savings account. He pinned the registration documents for the Sterling Vanguard Limited Shell Company directly beneath it, tracing the exact flow of the stolen funds from a dedicated wife to a greedy mistress. He labeled the third folder humiliation. This file contained the transcribed audio recording from his smartphone. It held every cruel, degrading word Julian had spoken while Chloe was frantically packing for her double shift. It documented Julian calling Arthur a useless burden and treating Chloe like an indentured servant. It was the undeniable proof of the psychological torture Julian utilized to maintain his lavish lifestyle. He labeled the fourth and final folder unfilial conduct. Arthur inserted the photographs he had taken that very morning with his hidden phone camera. The images showcased the peeling paint of Shady Pines, the stained ceiling tiles, and the frail, weeping figure of Margaret Vance sitting in her freezing room. He included his meticulous notes calculating her meager existence on $1,200 a month, starkly contrasted against the receipt for Julian's $15,000 Rolex watch. With the physical evidence categorized, Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. Gathering the evidence was only half the battle. Presenting it to a malignant narcissist required a flawless, airtight script. Julian would not simply confess and apologize. He would fight like a cornered predator. Arthur closed his eyes and began to play out the impending confrontation, moving the chess pieces in his mind. He anticipated every single psychological defense mechanism Julian would deploy. Julian would first attempt absolute denial. He would claim the photographs were doctored or taken completely out of context. Arthur prepared his countermeasure. He would produce the bank transaction timestamps that perfectly aligned with the dates and locations on the photos. Julian would then pivot to deflection. He would argue that the shell company was a highly complex, legitimate investment portfolio built to secure Chloe's future. Arthur mentally prepared the credit card statements showing that an investment portfolio does not purchase a $12,000 diamond necklace or a $4,000 purse. Finally, when the facts became insurmountable, Julian would resort to victim blaming. He would look at Chloe and tell her she was always working, that she was emotionally distant, and that he was lonely. He would try to make his betrayal her fault. That was the exact moment Arthur planned to deploy the audio recording, proving that Julian had intentionally orchestrated her exhausting schedule specifically to drain her bank accounts and keep her out of his way. Arthur opened his eyes. He aligned the 4 crimson folders perfectly on the edge of his desk. The trap was absolutely airtight. Every lie had a documented countermeasure. Every manipulation had a receipt. He reached for his phone. It was time to set the perfect bait and invite the monster to his own slaughter. The morning sun broke through the heavy curtains of Arthur Pendleton's study, illuminating the 4 crimson folders aligned perfectly on his mahogany desk. The evidence was secured. The verdict was written. Now, the executioner needed to lure the condemned man to the gallows. For a monster driven entirely by vanity and bottomless greed, the bait had to be something shiny, valuable, and easily liquidated. Arthur left the study and walked slowly down the hallway to his master bedroom. He opened the bottom drawer of his heavy oak dresser and retrieved a small, faded velvet box. He popped the rusted clasp. Inside rested a platinum engagement ring set with a flawless 3-carat diamond, flanked by 2 deep blue sapphires. It had belonged to his late wife, Eleanor. He had purchased it 40 years ago after a massive promotion at the auditing firm. It was a symbol of decades of unwavering loyalty, shared sacrifices, and profound love. Using it as bait to trap a parasite like Julian Vance felt like a desecration, but Arthur knew Eleanor would have wanted him to use any weapon necessary to protect their only daughter. He snapped the velvet box shut and slipped it into the pocket of his thick woolen cardigan. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water to clear his throat, and picked up his smartphone. He dialed Chloe's number. The phone rang 4 times before Chloe answered. Her voice was thick with sleep and exhaustion, a clear indicator that she had just returned from another brutal overnight shift at the hospital. Arthur immediately adopted his disguise. He dropped his vocal register, injecting a wet, rattling wheeze into his breathing. He made his voice tremble, sounding like a man standing very close to the edge of his own mortality. He greeted his daughter, apologizing profusely for waking her. Chloe instantly shifted into her caretaker role, her fatigue vanishing beneath a wave of genuine concern. She asked him if he was feeling ill again, offering to drive over immediately. Arthur let out a weak, fabricated sigh. He told her his body was just feeling the heavy weight of the years. He explained that he had spent the early hours of the morning sorting through some old boxes in the closet because he was feeling nostalgic. He paused, letting a strategic silence build the emotional tension. Then, his voice cracking perfectly, he told her he had found Eleanor's diamond ring. Chloe gasped softly. She remembered the ring from her childhood, knowing it was the most valuable physical possession her parents had ever owned. Arthur continued his performance. He told Chloe that his time was limited and he did not want the ring gathering dust in a dark drawer. He said he wanted her and Julian to have it. He twisted the psychological knife with absolute precision, adding that he knew Julian was drowning in the agonizing stress of $35,000 in medical debt for his mother. Arthur suggested, with the utmost fake innocence, that the vintage diamond could be appraised and sold. He claimed it could fetch tens of thousands of dollars, completely erasing their fabricated financial burden. On the other end of the line, Arthur heard Chloe begin to weep. Her tears were born of pure gratitude and sheer relief. She told her father he was too generous and that she could never sell her mother's ring. Arthur heard the rustle of bedsheets through the receiver. Julian had woken up. Arthur strained his ears, listening to the muffled, distant voices in the background. He heard Chloe whispering to her husband, explaining her father's incredible offer. The transformation in Julian's demeanor was instantaneous and entirely predictable. The man who had called Arthur a useless, pathetic burden just 24 hours ago was suddenly wide awake. Arthur heard Julian's muffled voice, no longer laced with disgust, but sharp with predatory excitement. The mere mention of a 3-carat vintage diamond, an asset easily worth $50,000 on the private market, completely overrode Julian's disdain for his father-in-law. Greed was the ultimate master of a narcissistic mind. Chloe came back on the line. Her voice was lighter, buoyed by the sudden shift in her husband's mood. She told Arthur that Julian was deeply moved by the gesture. She said Julian insisted they come over that very afternoon to spend quality time with him and properly accept the gift. They would host a small, intimate tea party in his living room. Arthur smiled, his pale eyes completely devoid of warmth. He told his daughter in a shaky whisper that he would love nothing more than to see them both. He promised to have a fresh pot of Earl Grey tea waiting. He ended the call and tossed the smartphone onto the kitchen counter. The frail, trembling old man vanished instantly. Arthur stood tall, his breathing steady and deep. The predator had taken the bait with embarrassing eagerness. Arthur walked back to his study. He picked up the 4 crimson folders labeled adultery, embezzlement, humiliation, and unfilial conduct. He placed them meticulously inside a vintage, hard-shell leather briefcase. The briefcase featured 2 brass combination locks. Arthur rolled the tiny dials, setting the combination to Chloe's birth date. He snapped the latches shut, securing the explosive truth inside. He carried the heavy briefcase into the living room and pushed it deep underneath the dark mahogany coffee table, hiding it entirely from view. He then went to the kitchen and prepared the tea service, setting out delicate porcelain cups and a silver tray. He checked his reflection in the hallway mirror. He purposefully unbuttoned his cardigan unevenly and ruffled his thinning gray hair to look disheveled and vulnerable. He retrieved his wooden cane from the corner. Arthur sat down in his armchair, resting his hands on the curved wooden handle of his cane. The stage was set. The trap was locked. All that remained was for Julian Vance to walk through the front door, expecting a diamond, only to receive a death sentence. The doorbell echoed through the quiet suburban house precisely at 3 o'clock. Arthur Pendleton took a slow, deep breath, perfectly aligning his hunched posture before shuffling toward the foyer. He pulled the heavy oak door open. Chloe stood on the porch, her eyes immediately scanning his face for any signs of worsening illness. Right behind her stood Julian Vance. Julian looked like he had just stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, exuding the effortless wealth of a top-tier financial director. He offered Arthur a blinding, practiced smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He stepped across the threshold, bringing the scent of expensive cologne into the modest hallway, and placed a patronizing hand on Arthur's frail shoulder. Julian expressed his deep concern for Arthur's health, using a tone reserved for speaking to a slow child. He claimed he had rushed over the moment Chloe called, putting all his crucial client meetings on hold because family always came first. Arthur nodded weakly, thanking Julian for his immense sacrifice. He led them into the living room, gesturing for them to sit on a floral-patterned sofa. Julian sat down with a heavy sigh of feigned exhaustion, casually adjusting his cuffs to ensure his $15,000 Rolex was subtly visible. His gaze darted immediately to the side tables, the mantelpiece, and the shelves, hungrily searching for a small velvet box. Arthur excused himself to the kitchen to retrieve the tea service. When he returned carrying the silver tray, he initiated the next phase of his physical performance. He made his forearms tremble violently. The delicate porcelain teacups rattled loudly against their saucers, threatening to spill hot Earl Grey tea over the rim. Julian watched the pathetic display with a barely concealed smirk. He leaned back into the sofa cushions, clearly disgusted by the sight of the weak old man, yet entirely thrilled by the prospect that this failing body was about to hand over a 3-carat vintage diamond. Chloe immediately jumped up from the sofa, her face tight with worry. She took the heavy silver tray from her father's shaking hands, apologizing and telling him he should not be carrying heavy things in his condition. Arthur sank into his armchair, releasing a long, raspy breath. He thanked his daughter, playing the role of a man completely devoid of strength. Chloe poured the tea, handing a cup to Julian. Julian took a sip, placing the cup down on the glass coffee table, and decided to accelerate the agenda. His greed was a living, breathing entity in the room, making him utterly impatient. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and put on his mask of deep, tragic sorrow. He looked at Arthur and expressed his profound gratitude. He said Chloe had told him about Eleanor's ring. He lowered his voice, making it sound thick with fabricated emotion, and confessed that the $35,000 medical debt for his mother was crushing his soul. He claimed he had not slept in weeks, agonizing over how to afford Margaret's experimental treatments. He told Arthur that the vintage diamond was not just a gift, but a literal lifeline that would save his mother from immense suffering. Arthur listened to the masterful lie without blinking. He looked at Julian's tailored suit and the luxury timepiece strapped to his wrist. He thought of the freezing, decaying room at Shady Pines and the tears of a forgotten mother. The sheer audacity of Julian's sociopathy was almost breathtaking. Arthur kept his voice a fragile whisper. He told Julian that a man should never have to suffer under the weight of such terrible secrets. He said he understood completely how a heavy burden could destroy a family, and it was finally time to bring everything into the light. Julian smiled, a genuine expression of predatory victory. He reached out and squeezed Chloe's hand, fully expecting the old man to produce the velvet box from his pocket. Arthur did not reach into his pocket. Instead, he gripped the wooden handle of his cane and leaned forward, pretending to struggle against the stiffness in his lower back. He reached deep under the mahogany coffee table. Julian watched intently, his brow furrowing slightly. A velvet box was small. The motion Arthur was making required both hands. Arthur grasped the thick leather handle of the vintage briefcase. He pulled it out from the shadows and lifted it with a sudden, shocking lack of hesitation. The violent trembling in his hands completely vanished. He set the heavy, hard-shell briefcase squarely onto the glass coffee table with a loud, definitive thud that made the porcelain teacups rattle in their saucers. The sound shattered the polite atmosphere of the room. Chloe stared at the weathered leather, utterly confused. Julian dropped his practiced smile. His eyes darted from the briefcase to Arthur's face. He asked, his voice losing its smooth cadence, what this was supposed to be. He stated that Chloe had explicitly mentioned a diamond ring. Arthur leaned back in his armchair. He did not hunch his shoulders. He looked directly into Julian's eyes, dropping the raspy wheeze from his voice entirely. He spoke with the crisp, cold authority of a forensic auditor ready to hand down a terminal sentence. He told Julian that there was indeed a gift waiting on the table, but it was not a diamond. It was something infinitely more valuable. He placed his steady hands on the brass combination locks, the metal cold against his fingertips, ready to open the vault of Julian's complete destruction. The twin brass locks on the vintage leather briefcase snapped open with two sharp, metallic clicks that echoed like gunshots in a quiet living room. Arthur Pendleton did not rush. His movements were fluid and methodical, the hands of a veteran auditor laying out a terminal balance sheet. He lifted the heavy leather lid and reached inside, retrieving the 4 thick crimson folders. He placed them in a neat stack in the center of the glass coffee table, right beside the delicate porcelain teacups. Julian Vance stared at the folders, his jaw clenched tight. The polished veneer of the successful financial director was beginning to crack, revealing the frantic, calculating predator beneath. He demanded to know what kind of sick joke this was, his voice rising in pitch. Arthur ignored the outburst. He slid the first crimson folder, labeled embezzlement, across the smooth glass. He opened it and spread the bank statements out so they directly faced his daughter. He spoke with a chilling, absolute calm. He told Chloe to look at the highlighted transaction. He stated clearly that the $35,000 she had sacrificed her health to save did not go to any hospital or medical facility. He pointed a steady finger at the receiving account name. He read the words Sterling Vanguard Limited aloud, explaining that it was a shell corporation registered in Delaware. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes wide with confusion. She recognized her own joint account numbers, but the destination made no sense. She looked at Julian, silently pleading for an explanation. Julian erupted. He sprang up from the floral sofa, his face flushed a deep, ugly red. He pointed an aggressive finger at Arthur and began to shout. He deployed his gaslighting tactics with desperate ferocity. He turned to Chloe, his voice dripping with fabricated outrage and pity. He told her not to look at the papers. He claimed her father had finally lost his mind, that Arthur was suffering from severe dementia and paranoia. He insisted that the documents were amateur forgeries, printed out by a jealous, pathetic old man who could not stand to see them happy and successful. He painted himself as the victim of a malicious, delusional smear campaign. Chloe flinched at the volume of her husband's voice. She looked down at the documents again, her medical training conflicting with the absolute panic rising in her chest. She whispered that the routing numbers looked real, her hands beginning to shake. Arthur did not raise his voice to match Julian's frantic yelling. His silence was infinitely heavier. He simply reached for the second crimson folder, labeled adultery. He flipped it open and tossed the high-resolution photographs onto the table, covering the bank statements. The image of Julian and Sienna Sterling laughing on the sun-drenched aspen balcony landed face up. It was immediately followed by the security still of Julian kissing the young woman inside the Cartier boutique. Finally, Arthur placed the receipt for the $12,000 diamond necklace right in the center of the visual evidence. He calmly stated that Sterling Vanguard Limited was named after Sienna Sterling, the woman Julian had taken to Aspen while Chloe was working double overnight shifts in the pediatric ward. Julian stared at the photographs, the color draining entirely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The physical evidence was a brick wall his silver tongue could not penetrate. But the ego of a narcissist refuses to surrender. Julian pivoted wildly, changing his strategy in a fraction of a second. He slammed his hand onto the glass table, making the teacups rattle violently. He yelled that the photos were heavily manipulated, a pathetic Photoshop job bought with Arthur's meager retirement funds. He looked at Chloe, his eyes wild, commanding her to believe him. He told her she was his whole world and that Arthur was a poisonous snake trying to destroy their beautiful marriage because he was lonely and miserable. Chloe picked up the photograph from Aspen. Her tears fell freely now, splashing onto the glossy paper. She recognized the specific custom-tailored ski jacket Julian was wearing. It was the same jacket she had picked up from the dry cleaners for him 2 days before his supposed business trip to Chicago. The foundation of her reality was actively collapsing, but Julian's relentless screaming was clouding her judgment. She looked back and forth between her father and her husband, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Arthur recognized that Julian was trying to drown the truth in sheer volume and emotional manipulation. It was time to deploy the weapon that could not be argued against or dismissed as a forgery. Arthur reached into the pocket of his cardigan and retrieved his smartphone. He unlocked the screen and opened the audio file he had recorded just days prior, when he had played the sick, sleeping burden on their sofa. Arthur looked directly at Julian, his pale blue eyes piercing through the man's crumbling facade. He pressed play and placed the phone gently on the glass table. Julian's own voice filled the living room, crisp and incredibly cruel. The recording captured him complaining to Chloe about the house smelling like medicinal rub. It played the exact moment Julian called Arthur a pathetic, useless burden who belonged in a cheap state-run nursing home. Julian froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The air was sucked completely out of his lungs. Then, the audio continued, delivering the fatal strike. The recording played Julian's annoyed sigh as he complained about Chloe. The digital voice of her husband echoed in a silent room, stating that he was tired of having his pristine townhouse treated like a hospice ward, and that Chloe needed to work more extra hours so he would not have to worry about his finances. The utter contempt, the absolute lack of love or respect, was captured with pristine clarity. Chloe dropped the photograph. Her hands flew to cover her mouth to stifle a gut-wrenching sob. The documents could be debated. The photographs could be argued. But that voice, dripping with profound disdain and manipulation, was undeniably her husband. It was the voice he used when the mask came off. The gaslighting instantly evaporated, leaving nothing but the monstrous, ugly truth exposed in the center of the room. The audio recording clicked off, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Julian Vance stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, the pristine mask of the caring husband entirely shattered. Chloe sat on the floral sofa, her hands trembling violently over her face, weeping with the profound grief of a woman realizing her entire marriage was a meticulously constructed cage. Arthur Pendleton did not offer Julian a single second to recover or fabricate a new lie. He reached for the fourth and final crimson folder on the glass coffee table, the one labeled Unfilial Conduct. He opened it and slid the bleak, depressing photographs of Shady Pines Convalescent Center toward his daughter. He tapped the screen of his smartphone, switching from the audio file to a video he had recorded during his freezing bus trip to the facility. He turned the phone so both Chloe and Julian could see the screen. The video played, showing Margaret Vance sitting in her threadbare cardigan in the damp, decaying room. Margaret's frail, tearful voice filled the living room. She wept on camera, stating clearly that she had not seen her son in 8 long months. She confessed that she survived solely on her Social Security check of $1,200 a month and that there were no experimental arthritis treatments. Arthur looked at Julian, his voice devoid of any mercy. He stated that Julian had looked into his exhausted wife's eyes and taken $35,000 to save his dying mother, only to abandon that same mother to rot in a concrete cell while he bought diamonds for his mistress. The sheer magnitude of the absolute truth finally cornered the predator. Julian looked at the bank statements, the photographs of Sienna Sterling, the audio recording of his own cruelty, and the video of his weeping mother. Every exit was sealed. Every lie was exposed. In a narcissistic mind, when the flawless reflection shatters, the underlying reality does not emerge as remorse or guilt. It emerges as pure, unadulterated rage. Julian let out a guttural sound, a mix of a laugh and a snarl. His face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. He stopped trying to deny the evidence. Instead, he embraced his monstrosity. He turned his venomous gaze toward Chloe, who was looking up at him through her tears, silently begging him to say it was all a terrible mistake. Julian told her to stop crying like a pathetic child. His voice was loud, echoing off the walls with cruel intensity. He sneered that she was unbearably boring. He yelled that he was suffocating in their marriage, complaining that she always came home exhausted, always smelled like hospital antiseptic, and never offered him the glamorous lifestyle he fundamentally deserved. He justified his betrayal with terrifying ease, claiming he had to take her money because he was destined for greatness, while she was perfectly content being a miserable, overworked nurse. Chloe recoiled, sinking deeper into the sofa cushions as if struck by a physical blow. The man she had loved, the man she had worked double shifts to support, was looking at her with absolute disgust. Arthur remained seated, his posture rigid. He calmly asked Julian about Margaret. He asked how a man could justify leaving his own mother to freeze in a facility that smelled of bleach and despair. Julian pivoted his rage toward Arthur, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. He shouted that the old woman had lived her life and was nothing but a useless, expensive burden. He declared that he refused to drain his own potential to keep a dying woman comfortable, dismissing his mother's suffering as irrelevant to his own success. He looked down at Arthur, his fists clenching tight at his sides. He screamed that Arthur was a meddling, jealous old fossil who had just ruined everything. The rage consumed Julian entirely. He lost the last shred of his corporate composure. With a feral roar, the tailored financial director lunged across the glass coffee table, his hands reaching for Arthur's throat, intent on destroying the architect of his downfall. But Arthur Pendleton was not a fragile, helpless pensioner. He had anticipated the violent collapse of the narcissist. As Julian lunged forward, Arthur did not flinch, cower, or raise his wooden cane in defense. He simply reached into the right pocket of his woolen cardigan with the swift, steady precision of a man decades younger. He retrieved a canister of law enforcement-grade pepper spray he had purchased the day after hiring Victor Rollins. Without a single tremble in his hand, Arthur aimed the nozzle directly at Julian's face and pressed the trigger. A thick, blinding stream of chemical irritant hit Julian squarely in the eyes and inhaled breath. Julian shrieked in absolute agony. His momentum faltered instantly. He crashed hard into the edge of the glass coffee table, sending the delicate porcelain teacups shattering onto the expensive Persian rug. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, clawing frantically at his burning face, gasping for air as the incapacitating spray shut down his respiratory system. Arthur stood up slowly from his armchair. He looked down at the writhing, pathetic figure on the floor. He stated coldly that Julian had deeply underestimated the old man in the corner. At that exact moment, the wail of police sirens pierced the quiet suburban afternoon. The sound grew rapidly louder, approaching the house from down the street. Arthur had instructed Victor Rollins to submit the comprehensive dossier of financial fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse to his contacts at the Economic Crimes Division precisely 2 hours before the tea party began. The trap had not just been sprung. The cage was now permanently locked. Red and blue lights began to flash violently through the living room windows, signaling the absolute end of Julian Vance's gilded reign. Heavy boots thudded against the hardwood floor as 3 uniformed police officers stormed through the open front door, led by Victor Rollins. The officers quickly assessed the scene, stepping over the shattered porcelain to reach the writhing, weeping figure of Julian Vance. They hauled him to his feet, pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the living room was the definitive sound of his gilded empire collapsing. The officers read him his rights, his once smooth and persuasive voice now reduced to pathetic, agonizing gasps. As Julian was dragged out of the house and into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting patrol cars, the heavy silence returned. Chloe sat paralyzed on the floral sofa, the terrifying reality of her shattered marriage washing over her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. Arthur walked over and sat beside his daughter. He wrapped his arms tightly around her, completely abandoning the fragile disguise he had worn for weeks. He held her with the fierce, unyielding strength of a father protecting his only child, whispering softly that the nightmare was finally over and she was safe. The ensuing months brought a swift and absolute reckoning. Julian Vance lost everything he had built his arrogant identity upon. His prestigious financial firm terminated his employment the very morning news of his arrest broke. Sienna Sterling, the woman he believed was captivated by his charm, vanished into thin air the exact second federal investigators froze his hidden bank accounts. Left with nothing but his towering ego and a mountain of undeniable evidence against him, Julian was convicted of severe wire fraud and embezzlement. He traded his tailored suits for a standard prison uniform, sentenced to serve many long, miserable years behind bars. Chloe filed for divorce immediately. She sold the lavish townhouse, refusing to live inside the monument her husband had built on her suffering. She moved into a cozy, sunlit apartment just a few streets away from Arthur, choosing a life of quiet peace over hollow luxury. However, the most beautiful resolution came from the ashes of Julian's darkest cruelty. Arthur and Chloe worked tirelessly with Victor Rollins and a team of lawyers to recover a significant portion of the stolen funds. The very first thing they did was drive back to the bleak outskirts of the city. They walked into that freezing, decaying room and wrapped a thick, warm woolen coat around Margaret Vance's fragile shoulders. They carried her out of the concrete purgatory forever. Using the recovered money, they relocated Margaret to a premier, luxurious care community surrounded by lush gardens, warm sunlight, and deeply compassionate nurses. Margaret finally smiled, weeping tears of pure joy, knowing she was safe and surrounded by a family that genuinely loved her. This story leaves us with a profound and timeless life lesson. True wealth is never measured by expensive watches, designer clothes, or luxury vacations built on the pain of others. True wealth lies in the honesty, loyalty, and unwavering love of family. It teaches us that manipulation and deceit may build a temporary palace, but the truth is a storm that will inevitably tear it down to the foundation. Furthermore, we must never underestimate the quiet, observant people in our lives. Sometimes, the strongest protectors do not wear armor, they carry walking canes and harbor an ocean of patience. If you felt moved by this journey, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends and family so you can listen to more compelling and captivating stories every single day. We want to know how this story made you feel. How does Arthur's brilliant strategy or Chloe's unwavering empathy relate to experiences in your own real life? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below because we truly desire to listen to the feelings coming from the very bottom of your hearts. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video a life filled with excellent health, joyful moments every single day, and endless peace. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.